All right, welcome to the Toulmin Model Explained. This is explained in detail for your textbook, but I want to make sure that I take a moment just to share with you how this model works and why it's important to understanding argumentation, and especially helping you with your rhetorical analysis essay. And so I think you're going to find this framework for looking at and dissecting arguments very, very helpful. So first, why does this matter? Just some brief background. This actually was a framework that Stephen Toulmin, hence the name of the Toulmin model, came up with. He wanted a logical framework that didn't just necessarily follow, the logical argumentation models that philosophy and other disciplines use. And he really wanted folks to have something where they could understand everyday arguments. And his model includes 6 components. The first is a claim, and we're going to talk a little bit about what that is in the next slide. Grounds, you'll often see this known as evidence. Warrant, which for those of you that might have had some difficulty, discerning between deductive and inductive reasoning, a warrant is definitely a type of inductive reasoning. It's often inferential, which means you're making an inference by, looking at the facts and the evidence that's there and then really helping you make that overarching claim. Backing, which is additional evidence and justification for the warrant. Qualifier, which really is just a way of saying, how much does the arguer or the author of the argument believe and feel confident in the force of their particular argument. And that's not just, whether or not you feel confident, it's also what's the probability of this argument actually coming to fruition. And then the rebuttal. And most of you are probably very familiar with the idea of a rebuttal, especially if you have siblings or parents. Someone will give one side and then the other person will give the other side. In your textbook, one of the strategies that rhetorician Peter Elbow uses is the doubting and believing game, where you might have a controversial claim and then you want to give the reasons that the doubter would believe as he or she would, and then the reasons why the believer would believe as he or she would. So let's break this down into the most simple terms, what we often call layman's terms. So in terms of the claim, this is essentially the overall idea of the argument. So what the author is trying to get across to their audience. And the 3 types of claims are often fact, judgment or value, and policy. So that's going to be important to keep in mind, especially when you're summarizing for the rhetorical analysis essay as well. Grounds again, is just simply, a synonym for evidence, another way of saying evidence. And it's the evidence that the author of the argument offers to the audience to show why their argument matters, what it's based in. And grounds are often based, again, also on 3 things. So evidence, and by evidence we mean facts, statistics, things that are often empirical in nature. You can replicate and actually find out that potential, piece of truth. Source credibility. So, is the source reliable? Is it credible? Is this something that actually would stand up when being looked at by a larger body of people? And then analysis and reasoning. So that's the second component, actually the third component of grounds. And then a warrant. And a warrant is an inferential leap. It basically connects, number 1, the claims, to number 2, the grounds. And it's often implicit, which simply means that it's not directly stated. Warrants are based on Aristotle's 3 modes of persuasion that we've talked a lot about in class: ethos, logos, and pathos, and also shared values. So let's say that the audience that you're speaking to, you'd want to be able to know what kinds of shared values you share with that audience prior to making your argument. You're going to have a higher success rate of actually having your audience understand your point of view if you're able to at least establish a common ground. And those shared values are definitely something that many arguers are going to appeal to. So in the United States, we have values of freedom, the freedom of speech, the freedom to bear arms, lots of different rights and freedoms in the Bill of Rights. And so there are certain shared values that you might want to appeal to based on that. The next parts of the Toulmin model include backing. And backing is just additional justification of the warrant. So if you make that inferential leap that connects the claim to the backing, or the grounds rather, the backing is just additional evidence and justification. The qualifier, again, this is just the way of how probable or sure is the author in terms of actually thinking that his or her argument is valid. So what's that degree of force? And then the rebuttal, again, is, I think, one of the most important aspects of the argument, because it shows that the person who's making the argument is actually aware of what his or her opposition might counter with. And counter arguments are really powerful, and nods to the opposition are a really powerful rhetorical strategy, because it shows that you've considered the bigger picture and that you're not so one-sided and only looking at your own argument that you haven't stopped to think about what other people might have to say in really in regards to what you're advocating. And I think one of the things that's really important about the rebuttal component is that it acknowledges that there might be some possible limitations or potentially some exceptions to the argument that the author is making. Really nuanced arguments often will think of some preemptive way to think about how those rebuttals might be handled. So that's also important. So those are the 6 components of the Toulmin model. And I want to give an example that we can look at together. And so this is a political cartoon by R.J. Matson. You might notice him because he often published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He also publishes for many other publications across the United States. And you can kind of see the little Monopoly man, so if anyone's ever played that board game, he would look very familiar. He's iconic. He's kind of part of an American, board game nostalgia. And then you see this tombstone. It says, R.I.P. the American middle class. He's kind of dancing on the grave. And you see a shovel. So kind of implying potentially that this is a grave that's been freshly dug and freshly buried. Here's my source, so you can just see an example of what MLA citation would look like for a cartoon. And so let's actually apply the Toulmin model to this particular cartoon. So first we're going to start with the claim. There is really literally 4 words in this particular cartoon. But there's obviously a claim that's being made by Matson. And for me, I perceive his claim to be that the incredibly wealthy class, in other words, the Monopoly man is who I think is representing the wealthy class, has killed the American middle class. That would be the claim of this cartoon. And his grounds, this would be the evidence that supports that claim, is that the top 1% of Americans own 35.4% of all privately held wealth. And the mean household income of the top 1% is over $1 million, and their actual net worth is actually over $16 million. So that's some evidence to help support that claim. And then we look at the warrant. So again, remember, the warrant is that inferential leap. It's the inference that connects the claim, which is over here, to the grounds. And so the warrant that I think that Matson is arguing in this potential political cartoon is that the distribution of wealth in the United States is uneven and unfair and has led to a nation of the super rich or the poor, and that there's not much space for the middle class. And so that's the first 3 components of the Toulmin model. So claim, grounds, warrant. Let's look at the second half. And there's the works cited as well. So the second half, we have backing. So this is, what kind of additional evidence are you going to use to support that warrant, that inference, where I was saying that Matson definitely looks like he's proposing that the American middle class is definitely dying because of this wealth disparity. So additional backing that you might want to have is evidence that explains how the U.S. middle class life is becoming more difficult and more elusive. In other words, it's not as prevalent. So you might want to look for evidence that shows about, how many people are actually able to afford and buy a home, how many people actually have what would be considered quote unquote good paying jobs. And keep in mind that to be considered middle class in the United States, you need to make an income over $50,000 a year. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then also just being able to take care of one's family. So whether that means being able to pay for health care or for schooling or whatever it might be, there are certain values. Again, we talked about the shared values as being an example here that Americans hold near and dear. Then you'd want to look at the qualifier. And again, that qualifier is looking at how probable and how much does the arguer believe that this potential argument is really and truly how reality appears. And so the qualifier that I would see from Matson's cartoon is that the disappearing middle class and the disparity of wealth are facts that few scholars or economists or sociologists really contradict or dispute. This is definitely something that you're seeing, and there's even this theory of what's called the middle class squeeze, where more and more of the middle class is squeezed out by the poor and by the super wealthy. And then the rebuttal, again, this is really showing, what might be some rebuttals to Matson's political cartoon. The rebuttal might be that the middle class is, doing just fine, thank you very much, and that there are many families that have a median, family income above $50,000. And you'd want to have research, that obviously supports that rebuttal. Another rebuttal might be that those with wealth have earned it. They haven't killed the middle class, they enhance it. They provide jobs. They are the ones that, help boost the economy. So there are lots of different rebuttals that you could potentially brainstorm for this model. But I wanted to show you how the Toulmin model helps you actually look at the strengths and weaknesses of a particular argument, and really to be able to look at an argument and ask yourself, does it achieve what it's setting out to do? And keep in mind, this is a relatively simple cartoon. There are literally 4 images: a shovel, the Monopoly Man, the tombstone, and what looks to be a gravesite. That's it. And so there's not necessarily a whole lot of information here, and I got all of this just from using the Toulmin model to be able to analyze it. So I think one of the things that will be really helpful to you as you're moving forward is that the Toulmin model will help you think about summarizing the essay or news article for essay 1, the rhetorical analysis. It's going to be really important, I would argue essential, for you to be able to outline the claim, the grounds, the warrant, the backing, the qualifier, and the rebuttal for that particular article that you are analyzing, because you're going to want to include that in your 1 to 2 paragraph summary. And then down the road, as we progress this semester, you're going to want to refer to the Toulmin framework to be able to analyze other arguments, to really be able to say, does it achieve its purposes? Why or why not? So that's the Toulmin model in a nutshell. Definitely refer to your textbook to find out more. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Thanks, everybody.